Okay, folks, welcome to another Bird of the Month. This month we're going to discuss migratory birds, in particular, the migratory birds that we're going to see in and around Kentucky. We'll also start by talking a little bit about what migration is, how it works, how birds are prompted to begin migration, and a little bit about general migration ecology. So without further ado, let's dive right in. So, when thinking about where birds could occur, it's helpful to think about a range map. So, here's a range map taken from the eBird website for the wood thrush. Now, this kind of reddish area is where the wood thrush breeds. This blue area is where the wood thrush winters, and these yellow areas are regions where wood thrush can be found during migration. In this case, fall and spring migration. So generally we think of the migration route as the sort of in-between area between wintering and breeding grounds. And that is for basically the habitats where species could be found during that time. So the wood thrush provides us a nice example. It's a very widespread species. So take a look at this yellow area here along the Gulf Coast. The wood thrush is really only found along the Gulf Coast during migration. We can look at another example. This is the chestnut-sided warbler, really lovely neotropical migrant. So they breed throughout the kind of upper Midwest and lower boreal region and down through the Appalachians. This is the red breeding area. They winter throughout mostly Central America, a little bit of the southern United States. And you can see that there's a large swath where the species is found during migration. Now, migratory behavior is usually a bit more complicated than just the birds breed here, they move there during the winter, and the migratory route is the whole area in between. It's usually a bit more complicated in that birds don't migrate south or north in one single movement. What they usually do is they make small jumps and then take breaks between those jumps. So those little breaks are called stopover locations, and those provide birds like this lovely Swainson's thrush here a chance to rest during their migration and refuel, so eating fruit or insects, things like that, to fuel their, as the case may be here, southward migration. This is an example from DeLuca et al. 2019. It's a scientific paper, and I've kind of removed some of the details just to simplify things a little bit here. But what these researchers did is they put these teeny little tracking tags on blackpoll warblers that were captured throughout the boreal forest. And you can see these arcing movements are where the birds traveled. So this is the capture location, the circle. And these triangles, here and here, are the individual birds, which are, of course, color-coded, stopover locations. So, for instance, this purple bird moved south, and then it kind of traveled along the Atlantic coast here, flew across, hit Venezuela, moved along the coast of northern South America a little bit before it finally went into northern Brazil, where its wintering territory was. So these stopover sites, these triangles, are where birds are refueling and resting. Now, the blackpoll warbler may not be the best example of this because they migrate really huge distances in one go. Birds may jump only a few counties in a night, and it could be a rather slow migration. Some birds take several months to migrate south. There are also species with a facultative or a partial migration, so that they migrate in some parts of their range but not others, or the population may shift around a little bit, but the general occurrence patterns remain mostly static. A good example of this would be blue jays. So this is the distribution of the blue jay. In this case, the year-round distribution is shown in green, and this blue area is winter only. So this area here through central Texas is an area that only sees blue jays in the winter. So it demonstrates that they have some migratory tendencies, but they may not appear to migrate out of most of their distribution. So you may be wondering what cues do birds use to initiate migration? Because migration is a big deal, and many birds, songbirds for example, are migrating south for the first time in their lives, never having been shown how to do it. And as we'll discuss, many birds aren't actually taught how to migrate, they just do it naturally. One way that birds orient to head south in the fall or north in the spring is the use of the stars. So a variety of studies have shown birds using the stars to orient on their migration. Now, it's important to remember that for a lot of songbirds, like our friend the blackpoll warbler or the Swainson's thrush, migration is a nocturnal behavior. So that's why you don't go outside and just see a lot of songbirds migrating. It's because this happens at night. And we've talked about this on From the Woods Today before. You can go out at nighttime. This time of year is a great time to do this, especially right after dark or right before sunrise. And you'll hear birds calling in the dark. And these are birds that are migrating, in our case, south for the winter. A great example of how researchers determined that birds use the stars as a cue to migrate is with these tools called an Emlyn funnel. And Emlyn took birds like indigo buntings and he put them into the bottom of this funnel. So here's a side view and then here's a top view. And they put them in this funnel, and at the bottom is an ink pad. And on the sides of the funnel are white paper. And the top is screened in so the bird can see out through the top, but they can't actually get out. So what happens is the bird, let's say it wants to go that way, it scrambles up, flapping and scrambling to try and get out. It hits the screen and slides back down. But because it was standing on this ink pad, it leaves footprints as to where it was trying to go. And throughout the course of a night, you can get a pattern as to where the bird wants to orient. Well, what Emlyn did, and other people have done since then, is put these birds outside and try this. Here's the North Star, and you can see that the birds are mostly orienting in a northerly direction. What you can do, however, is put the birds in a planetarium and orient the North Star correctly, and they behave normal. But if you flip the North Star around, the bird can be tricked into trying to migrate south, even though they should be going north. They're tricked because the planetarium is convincing them they're facing the other way. Now that's just one really cool example. A lot of long-lived species, especially social birds, use landmarks. Those are usually very intelligent species like geese. And this is taught frequently what we call vertically, so from parent to offspring, as is the case with like geese and swans. Or other species can be taught by unrelated members of their species. We call that a horizontal transmission of information. So that would be like crows, for example. They follow other crows, and actually that's one of the few passerine birds we see that migrates during the day. Of course, there's also genetics. Songbirds, as we've discussed, usually don't migrate with their parents. They're usually migrating solo in the dead of night. Once in a while, they'll be flocked up with a couple others of their species, but it's usually a solitary endeavor. And a recent couple of studies have looked at this with Swainson's thrush, for example, which we'll talk about several times today. And what they did is they looked at the genetics of migration. They found that some birds had a genetic predisposition to migrate through the interior of the United States and potentially across the Gulf of Mexico. Other birds tended to stay to the west coast and migrate south that way. So that's all well and good, and they found that that was genetically determined. Well, the really cool thing is they looked at birds that had a hybrid genotype. So a bird that was a mix between a mom that was this and a dad that was this, and they found that those birds, these orange lines, tended to travel up the middle, showing that it's very much a genetically predetermined behavior that these birds engage in. Of course, there are also eruptive species, as they're called. So, a good example of that would be the common redpoll, which is a northerly finch species. And this is their distribution here. You can see they breed basically around the Arctic Circle or very close to it. But in the winter time, they can winter throughout much of the boreal forest, but occasionally they extend into the Great Lakes and western United States. And some years yet, they also go even further south, occasionally even getting down into Kentucky. And good examples of this would be red-breasted nuthatch, common redpoll, and many other of these more northerly species. And it's usually this behavior driven by seed crops in the northern boreal forest. But a key a component of understanding eruptive birds is that they have a range where they're occasionally common and sometimes totally absent. So like some years we'll have, like last year's a great example, we had plenty of red-breasted nuthatches here in Kentucky. Who knows if we'll have them this year, but it varies by year whether they're found here in high numbers. Okay, so that's a little bit about migration ecology in eastern migratory birds. But let's dive into some common species that you might expect to see here in Kentucky and how to identify them. So I would say that one group of migratory birds that we see pretty commonly here in Kentucky are these kind of brown forest thrushes. And there's a number of them. We're going to only talk about a few of them here. One of them is the Swainson's thrush. We've already talked about this bird a bunch today. It's not much to write home about. Kind of these little black or I guess dark brown spots on the breast that kind of fade into a smudginess. It's got kind of this cool brown back and head that kind of can look greenish on some birds. The diagnostic feature, however, is this buffy pair of spectacles here around the eyes. It looks like it's wearing buffy glasses, if you will. Now, during the breeding season, they have a very beautiful song. I can play that for you here. But you're not likely to hear that much in migration. Mostly what we hear are these peep calls that they do while migrating. Another brown forest thrush that's quite common is the hermit thrush. So the hermit thrush, these thrushes are a little tricky. It looks a lot like the Swainson's thrush, but notice that it does not have the buffy spectacles. And the other key is that when you look at the back, it's got this very reddish tail. It makes it very distinctive and much more straightforward to identify than a lot of other groups of birds. So that a couple of diagnostic features on them. It's another one that has a very beautiful song. All the thrushes do. Here's the the hermit thrush song. But we're not likely to hear that during migration. More likely, we're going to hear vocalizations that sound more like these. And the last of the brown forest thrushes we're going to discuss, as you can see, is the wood thrush. Some have said that the wood thrush has the most beautiful bird song of all eastern North American birds, but again, we're not going to hear that beautiful song until springtime, which sounds like this. Usually during fall migration, we're going to hear either these series of pop, 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 pip, 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 these very snappy notes that they do, usually very early in the morning or very late at night. The next bird that's worth discussing, very common here in Kentucky during fall migration, and of course it breeds here too, is the gray catbird. So the gray catbird is a really interesting species. It's what we call a mimid. So they learn to imitate the sounds of other birds as a means of attracting a mate. But they don't do that song much during the fall. Mostly what this bird is doing is either these ratchet calls, as they're called, or the namesake cat-like meows. Next up, we have to talk about the American robin. I feel like we talk about the robin on almost every single episode of From the Woods Today, Bird of the Month. The American robin is another species very abundant in migration, and it's actually a thrush. It's just not particularly brown. But it's worth looking at a few of the different plumages that we see from American robins. This is an adult male. We've got that very kind of reddish orange breast and belly, dark head with white markings around the eyes, and this gray back. But you also have for instance, young juvenile females that may be very pale above and very pale below and have almost more intricate markings on the face. This would be a young female most likely. And occasionally you'll still see some juveniles. So this bird is still got a lot of its the spotting that you see on juvenile American robins, and it's just starting to get those reddish feathers that the species is so well known for. We won't hear much of the namesake, some of the classic songs of the American robin in the fall time. More likely you'll hear the whinny calls or various other calls like these. Of course, for me, when I think about fall and migrant birds, one major group that comes to mind are the blackbirds. And they have a variety of vocalizations, but we don't need to get into them here because a lot of them do sound quite similar this time of year. They're making a cluck note, most of them. But visually, they're very distinctive. So this bird here, this is the common grackle. Male and female are fairly similar. Distinctive, we've got this kind of bronzy iridescent body, this kind of purplish head, and this very light colored eye. And it's quite a large bird. It's one of the larger birds you're likely to see at your feeder. And it's got a very long bill, very long and pointed bill. Many people who feed wild birds aren't particularly fond of grackles because they eat a lot of bird feed. And they can also be bullies to other birds at the feeder. Another blackbird that we have is the red-winged blackbird. So the male has that kind of namesake red wing, occasionally with, or frequently in my experience, with a little bit of a yellow or a white border on it. But otherwise it's just a jet black plumage. Some males can kind of be scalloped with brown, especially younger males. And the female is sort of this almost sparrow-looking bird. But notice we've got a pretty long dagger-like bill, but not quite as extreme as the grackle. And you can almost get intermediate forms that look like one or the other. So this is an adult male, and this is probably an adult female. But like a young male that maybe doesn't have good genetics or hatched really late or whatever, may molt from looking like this as a juvenile to kind of an intermediate version. Or you might have a bird that's young but not quite on top of his game, and so he looks kind of like this but has a lot of brown mixed in. Sometimes you'll even have one that looks more like a female with a red wing patch, so they can be quite varied. And then of course the brown-headed cowbird, with the female being that drab clay color and the male being that iridescent kind of bluish green with a brown head. And frequently, all of these blackbirds will form groups together, sometimes single species flocks, but frequently they'll form mixed species blackbird flocks. We talked about the American goldfinch on a couple of our Bird of the Month episodes recently, but it's worth just touching base about them again. We're going to see a lot of these this time of year. This is a breeding male, but a lot of these birds are starting to become drab and look more like a female here. And of course, this is a juvenile, which there are still a lot of juveniles around. Notice the male has the black forehead, the breeding male has a black forehead, and this is a breeding female, still quite brightly colored, but also not as bright as the male. Expect your birds to look somewhat intermediate between the juvenile form and the adult form as they enter the fall, the non-breeding season. And these birds are highly migratory, but we have them all year round in Kentucky. And of course, we need to mention some of the warblers. Warblers are some of the favorites of bird watchers, and they're an extremely diverse group. We can see a wide variety here in Kentucky, like the common yellowthroat, the yellow warbler, and the yellow-rumped warbler, just to name a few. And again, there are dozens of species of warblers we can find. The black and white warbler, the American redstart, so this is a male American redstart and a female here, and the black-throated green warbler. It's a really diverse group, so if you're really interested in looking at these really tiny little birds, they're very small, get out there this time of year. It's a great time of year to see these. I think the last group I have to discuss, at least in terms of individual groups, are the vireos. And I don't want to spend too much time on them here, but it is worth mentioning. We've got, for instance, the red-eyed vireo, which is kind of this greenish back and this dark gray and white markings on the face. The white-eyed vireo, which has this sort of yellow spectacles, a very stark white eye, and these kind of green and yellow and gray markings. And the blue-headed vireo, and these are by no means all the vireos we have, but a few of the common ones. Kind of has these white spectacles and this sort of bluish-gray head. So again, I would encourage folks that are interested in learning more about our migrant birds to get out there and listen for these birds as they're on their migratory routes. Listen for those Swainson's thrush calls in the early morning hours while it's still very dark and after dusk. Listen for that, sounding almost like a spring peeper. And the last thing I'd like to mention is kind of the end of migration as that approaches. Watch for winter arrivals. So for instance, golden crowned kinglets start to become more abundant. Everybody's favorite, the dark-eyed junco, and my favorite winter bird that we have, the white-throated sparrow. So keep an eye out for those birds that are going to migrate and spend the winter here, and tune in next time for our Bird of the Month, and we'll leave